Frank Ling is Chief Scientist at Anthropocene Institute. He's also a guest lecturer at Tokyo Institute of Technology and Ibaraki University, and was previously a research fellow at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and University of Tokyo. Frank consulted for various organizations, including Asian Development Bank and Jane Capital Partners. His work has been cited in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in a special report on global warming. And he's an editor of the cleantech.org and cleantech blog websites, and producer and host of science podcast Grok Science. So guys, if you want to know more, just Google the podcast. We have very fantastic content there. Frank, so what is the market potential for nuclear investment in current situation?
So in terms of investment, I think maybe one reference is this recent announcement of tripling the amount of nuclear power. So that would be an additional 800 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. And in terms of the overnight cost of building that, that could range, if we're assuming, anywhere from $2,000 per kilowatt to $20,000 using Vogel as a reference, then we're talking about an investment of potentially $1.6 to $16 trillion to meet that target. But even that, I think, pales the scale that's really needed. So electricity itself, I think, accounts for 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're tripling in that, that means we're only reducing greenhouse gas emissions by another 3.5% or so. So if you really want to talk about the global decarbonization, then we could go much further, probably an order of magnitude in terms of the nuclear capacity that's needed. So potentially the market is going to be a lot larger than even what's being announced here at COP28.
What are the trends in new kinds of financing that make it easier to find large nuclear projects? And that actually returns to Dale's point on appetites for return and how to make it attractive. Right now we invest short-term, getting into game only if we expect return in a year or 5. But with nuclear, it usually takes a decade before we get anything back. So with alternative financing and this like new trends, how we can instill those money coming into nuclear sector, giving those returns coming not so soon?
I think one of the challenges has been kind of ambiguity of what that means. And I think some of the efforts to include nuclear as part of that and also into green financing are really encouraging. But I think a bit more needs to be done globally. So that's one thing that, our colleagues have been very interested in trying to communicate that. And then on the philanthropy side, this is something that Bill Gates had said, that philanthropy has a role in the energy transition. And part of it, what philanthropy can do, is to communicate to all these different constituents and stakeholders on what the opportunities are, so that we bring policymakers and the greater investment community to join in these efforts. And then finally, I think one idea that Charles and a colleague of ours have been floating around is this idea of a portfolio approach. How do we minimize risk by taking a portfolio of various technologies, from those which are well known, but also include those which are high risk, high return as part of this portfolio, so that we kind of have a rational approach to designing these types of financial vehicles.
And I guess we have the wheel, we have ideas, we already kind of put together the structure. What can we learn from failed projects, unsuccessful projects, to make sure that this initiative gets us where we want to be, and we get as much as homework done before we jump into new project?
MIT came out with a study, The Future of Nuclear, a few years ago, and in one of their conclusions of why nuclear has gone so expensive was a lack of regulatory consistency or priorities, and also the fact that what they learned from the Korean and the French examples were that develop nuclear power plants, specifically in the context of large power plants, that you have the same process for fabricating and construction, then the costs come down much cheaper. So as Dale had pointed about, the role of technology is that we should explore other options like SMRs or even microreactors that potentially could be fabricated in a 3D print shop and then shipped and be scaled in a much more modular fashion than the current large type of reactors, which could be one way to get around the costs here.
Frank, you touched a little bit on the policy making and the lack of structured policy and regulations around nuclear. So can you elaborate or start a little bit on what areas in policymaking, specific areas that we need to advance to make sure that nuclear development gets enough support?
Yeah, I would say on the policy side, it's education awareness, right? I think there's still a lack of awareness in terms of what the opportunities are, especially if you're talking to, say, the political class, how they vote for supporting these technologies. So I would emphasize it's not just about climate, but also about energy security and economic opportunities. And I think those are the ways, at least politically, to get support. But at the same time, with kind of the scientific policymaking, we also need to figure out ways how to communicate that better to the public so that we also get public support at the same time.
Talking more about the newcomers, and I think how can we assure lenders to invest in particular area or particular region, taking into account all the challenges we have with currency that might be having hyperinflation at some point, how we work with those areas, especially in global south, in developing world?
So I actually live in Japan, and so I know there's been much increase of activity over the past year in terms of U.S.-Japan collaboration for nuclear technologies, but it's also in the context of providing these technologies to Southeast Asia and other countries which are still at the beginning of stages of urbanization and industrialization. So I know at these COP meetings there's always tension between development and decarbonization. And so this presents a big opportunity to develop some of these new technology, but deploy it and help. I think the term they use is leapfrog over the types of development that OECD countries have led, but to help them leapfrog over that and go directly to a decarbonized economy while developing at the same time. So that would be the big opportunity we see in collaborating across these regions.
Thank you so much. Well, we have to wrap up, but thank you, everyone. Thank you, our panelists.